again, thank you to all who came. It's the history portion. Don't fall asleep. Okay. Just kidding. My presentation is called The Fleet That Never Sailed. It's about canceled battleships from World War II. And, you know, we always hear about ships like the Iowa, or the Missouri, or the Bismarck, or the Arizona, the really famous battleships from World War II that did all kinds of amazing things. But the ones that you never hear about are the ones that never did anything because they were never built. And, you know, the biggest battleship ever built in terms of mass and gun power was the Japanese battleship Yamato. It carried 9 18.1-inch guns, meaning that the shell that it fired was 18.1 inches in diameter. The shell itself weighed approximately a ton, and these battleships could fire these shells almost 30 miles. So they were pretty serious, but even the Yamato is small compared to the ships I'm going to talk about today. A lot of the ships that weren't built were built for a variety of reasons, which I'll cover why, but for the most part, they were just a little bit too big. So what on earth am I talking about? Throughout the 20th century, countries all over the world built dozens of battleships, particularly in the early part of the 20th century during the Dreadnought race. And what that was Great Britain built a battleship called the HMS Dreadnought, which was the first all-big gun battleship. Before the Dreadnought was built, battleships would usually carry 4 main guns, which are usually 12 or 13-inch guns, and then they would carry a secondary battery, which would be either 7 or 8-inch guns, and then they would carry a tertiary battery, which was 5-inch guns. The problem with that is that when you're trying to track where your shells are going, all the splashes look the same, even though they're different calibers, so you can't tell which gun made which splash. So finally, Britain came up with the idea. They said, hey, what if we built a battleship with all big guns? And so the Dreadnought carried 10 12-inch guns instead of 4, which meant that it was a big shocker for everybody. And so when the Dreadnought came out, of course, everybody freaked out and said, oh my lord, you know, Great Britain's taking over, they have the biggest battleship, now we have to have one. And pretty soon, everybody had a Dreadnought. They either ordered it from Britain, and that was actually a really bad idea because if you ordered a ship from Britain, Britain considered it to be their naval reserve, and if they needed it, they would just take it. Or they would order them from other countries like the United States or Germany. And what happened was Germany and Britain had this big race, which I'll talk about in a second. But anyway, these battleships, there were dozens of them. There were small ones, like the coast defense ships built by the Nordic countries, or there were the really huge ones like the Missouri and the Yamato. But the ones that you don't hear about are ships that were designed, never built. Either they were started and weren't finished, or they were canceled before they were even begun. The world might be a very different place if these ships had been built. So the Washington Treaty was a major catalyst for World War II, but nobody ever hears about it. And back to the Dreadnought race. The Dreadnought race happened before World War I. The HMS Dreadnought was launched in 1905, and Great Britain immediately began to build a ton of Dreadnought battleships because they wanted to be the biggest in the world. In fact, Britain had a policy called the two-power standard, and that meant that they wanted their navy to be bigger than the next 2 largest navies put together. So they wanted to be big. Germany, on the other hand, had just become a unified country the century before, but they were determined to challenge Britain on the high seas. So the Germans built this fleet called the High Seas Fleet, which was pretty much the equal of the British. They didn't have as many ships, but the German ships were better. And unfortunately, after World War I, the High Seas Fleet was surrendered to the British, and Germany no longer had a navy, which meant that the biggest rival for Britain was knocked out. However, there were 2 new economies, the United States and Japan, which were rising extremely fast. And Great Britain and all of the European countries were totally ravaged by World War I. Their economy was, sunk. They were, had all this damage, like literal physical damage from the war. Their factories were destroyed. Particularly France was really wiped out. And all of a sudden, we have the United States and Japan, which had no fighting on their soil, with booming economies that are now starting to build fleets to rival Britain. So Britain began to, freak out. They realized, oh no, we're going to get taken over. So what do? They propose a disarmament treaty. They say, instead of trying to outbuild you guys, which we can't do because we don't have the economy, they're going to try to limit everybody to only having a certain number of ships, which kind of sounds like sour grapes to me, but that's how it worked out. Their rationale for it was they wanted to avoid another arms race like before World War I, and historians think that World War I was largely caused by the rivalry generated from the dreadnought race. And so they're thinking that if we don't have another arms race with these battleships, then we won't have another World War. That didn't happen. So what happened was they signed this treaty in Washington, D.C. in 1922, and they organized everything by ratios. So Great Britain and the United States were to have a 5 ratio, meaning they each got about 22 battleships. Japan got the 3 ratio, which meant they were limited to 10, and Italy and France were relegated to the 1.5 ratio. Germany, being the bad child of the group, didn't get any. Unfortunately, Japan didn't really like that agreement. They were thinking, wait a second, you're saying we're a second-rate power, we're only allowed to have 10 battleships and you're allowed to have 22? You know, they got really mad about that. So the next time that it came to renew the agreement in the London treaties, which I believe was 1932, Japan threw a fit and left. So after that, they were no longer in the negotiations, and because of that, this treaty limit sort of fell apart. Anyway, what this treaty means for these countries is that they're no longer allowed to build battleships for a period of 10 years, and they also have to limit their battleships to a certain tonnage, which means that they have to scrap a lot of the older ships. It also means that the fleets that they were currently building have to be scrapped as well. So all the ships that were under construction had to be gotten rid of. So these are the ships, I'll show you in a second, these are the ships that were canceled because of the Washington Treaty. Notice we had to scrap a lot more than the British did. Interesting. The British had these ships, which I'll go into more detail in a minute, but we were forced to scrap 13 ships with 16-inch guns. The British were forced to scrap 4 with 16-inch guns and 4 with 18-inch guns. And Japan also kind of got bad off. They had to scrap 4 with 18-inch guns and 8 with 16-inch guns. So Japan and the U.S. got off a lot worse from this treaty than the British did, which is interesting. So the American ships, we have the South Dakota class, which was going to be the world's most powerful battleship. We were going to build 6 of them. They were going to carry 12 16-inch guns. The next most powerful ship in the world at the time was the Japanese battleship Nagato, which carried 8 16-inch guns. This was our response to another Japanese group, the Tosa class, which I'll talk about in a second, which was under construction at the time. We got this far on the South Dakota. This is an actual picture of the South Dakota. If they didn't finish, they would have looked like this. They were pretty much an upsized version of the U.S. Navy ships that we had at the time. Had these ships been built, they most likely would have been at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked, and would have either been sunk or severely damaged. Like the other American battleships, they would have been brought back into service with significant refits and would have gone on to clean up at the end of the war. Very, very good ships. It's a shame we didn't get them. Then we had the Lexington class, and the Lexington class was a battle cruiser. Now the difference between a battleship and a battle cruiser is that a battleship is very heavily armored. A battle cruiser is very fast. And so the battle cruiser was another great concept invented by the British, which was a design for a ship that would be as fast as a cruiser, but as heavily armed as a battleship. In order to get that, you have to have very thin armor, and that was the battle cruiser's big weakness. Because of that, the British lost 3 battle cruisers in 1 day, and after that, the world pretty much stopped building battle cruisers, except for us, which we started to build the Lexingtons. We were going to build 6 Lexington-class battle cruisers. They would have been the longest ships in the world by far, and they would have carried 8 16-inch guns. They would have looked like this had they been finished. But after the Washington Treaty, they had a clause which said that you could convert 2 ships to aircraft carriers. So we took the 2 Lexingtons, 2 of them, and converted them into our first fleet carriers, the Lexington and the Saratoga. Wait, I thought I said this ship wasn't actually built. This is actually a Photoshopped picture taken from the USS Colorado, and then they stretched it a little bit, and voila, we have the Lexington. This comes from a really cool website called Alt Naval, which is a bunch of doctored photographs of canceled battleships, which unfortunately is no longer active because their server expired, but I managed to get some of them. This is what they actually looked like when they were finished as aircraft carriers. The Lexington was sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea, but the Saratoga survived the war. Then we had the Washington. The Washington was a Colorado-class battleship. We actually did build 3 Colorado-class battleships, the Colorado, the Maryland, and the West Virginia. The Maryland and the West Virginia were at Pearl Harbor, and the West Virginia was the last American battleship to fire at another battleship. The Washington was going to be the 4th ship. We got this far, but under the treaty, we had to stop building it and use it for target practice. Ouch. The British were building this ship called the N3, which is a really inspiring name. It would have been called the St. Andrew if it had actually been built, named after the patron saint of, I believe, Scotland. And there were going to be 4 ships in the class. It's postulated that they would be named St. Andrew, St. Patrick, St. Davis, and St. George after the patron saints of the 4 British countries. These would have been very powerful battleships. They would have carried 9 18-inch guns, which would have been bigger guns than we had, but not as many. But do you notice any problems with this design? Yeah?
The gun is facing the wrong way.
Well, there's no guns facing back, right? If you fired backwards, it would blow off this bit. Well, this was actually designed to have a smaller area of armor, or smaller citadel, so they would only have to armor this much of the ship. At least heavily. This part would have been probably lightly armored. When asked about this problem of facing backwards, the British admiral replied, well, British ships never run away, so that won't be a problem. Of course, if someone goes behind you, it's still a problem. This picture is actually really interesting. There's a guy on a website called DeviantArt, which is a website where a lot of artists can post their pictures, and he draws these during math class. And they are really great action pictures of what these ships would have looked like had they been made. I thought that they were really excellent additions to the presentation, and in this picture you can see the St. Andrew during the D-Day landings, and then this is the South Dakota, the American ship, so I thought that was kind of cool. The British, wait, what, huh? Oh, geez, another alt-naval picture. This is the Invincible. Again, another great British name. This was actually named after another battle cruiser, the Invincible, which didn't turn out to be so invincible because the Germans blew it in half. This would have been a very fast and powerful ship, a precursor to the fast battleship. It would have carried 9 16-inch guns, but it still had the same problems. So they had a unique perspective on shipbuilding. A lot of people also thought it wasn't a very good-looking design. It was kind of blocky as opposed to the American ships, which were very balanced. This is what it would have looked like had it entered service. It was actually a very good design. It would have been fast and powerful, but oh yes?
Why in the world did America sign a treaty with the British?
You know,
It blasted them out of the water.
Looking back on it, a lot of people wonder that. And a lot of people actually say that because Japan was so mad about it, the day the treaty was signed, World War II began. And America actually signed the treaty because we wanted to prevent another world war, which is really ironic because the signing of the treaty made Japan mad, causing them to start World War II. And actually, on a side note, remember I said Germany wasn't allowed to have any? They got really creative, and they built cruisers with battleship guns and called them pocket battleships. So they still got them. So that really didn't stop anybody. This is interesting. This picture compares size-wise this G3 Invincible design to the original Dreadnought. So battleships have gotten a lot bigger. Today, the G3 is probably about the size of the Missouri, maybe a little bit smaller. What? Oh, jeez. Okay, so Japan was going to build the Tosa class. I mentioned this earlier. The American South Dakota was built as a response to this, well, built. The Tosa class was a follow-on to the Nagato. The Nagato was a very successful Japanese battleship design, which was the world's first fast battleship, at least the world's first very good fast battleship. It carried 8 16-inch guns that could go 28 knots, which was faster than any battleship at the time. This was the follow-on, which would have carried 10 16-inch guns. This is actually a very classic World War I arrangement. This thing is called the Q turret, which is sort of in the middle. And this is a size comparison to the original Dreadnought. These would have been pretty good ships, but they were also scrapped under the terms of the treaty. This was part of Japan's ambitious construction plan called the 8-8 plan. And what that was Japan was determined to build 8 battleships and 8 battle cruisers for their fleet. What they ended up building were 2 battleships and no battle cruisers because of the Washington Treaty. Naturally, they were pretty mad. This ship wasn't built. However, they actually did get this far. They got really far on the Tosa, And what they ended up doing was the Tosa's sister ship, the Kaga, great names, there would have been two of these, was actually converted to an aircraft carrier. The Kaga was part of the aircraft carrier strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor. However, we got her back. Her second life didn't end very well at the Battle of Midway. This is actually from the diorama, but that pretty much shows how it ended. The Akagi class was the battle cruiser version of the Kaga class, or Tosa class, and they would have been longer, but have pretty much the same armament. Now, the Japanese are famous for their wacky bridge structures. They're called pagoda masts, and you can see it's very tall and very top-heavy. There's a better picture of it in the Tosa section. You can see that it's very, very tall. The Americans were famous for the cage mast, which often blew over in storms, so we weren't much better. But the Japanese had these crazy loopy pagoda masts, and they actually got worse on later ships. The Fuso, which was actually a World War I battleship that they modernized, pagoda mast was this tall and actually leaned slightly forward, so it seemed like a really good idea. They were also famous for their really weird funnels that kind of went back like this and then back up. You'll see another one of those soon. The Akagi was also converted to an aircraft carrier. That was one of the Akagi class battle cruisers. Originally, the Yamagi, which was its sister ship, was going to be converted to an aircraft carrier, but then it was destroyed in an earthquake. Why the earthquake destroyed a ship at sea? I don't know, but I think it was actually in the shipyard. Because of that, they had to go to the Akagi instead. Notice the really weird smokestack. The Japanese had smokestacks angled down towards the water. Perhaps they were into killing fish, I don't know. But it kept the gases away from the carrier deck, or at least it was supposed to. I guess it didn't work today. But they originally had this weird thing with 3 flight decks, which they later turned into 1 flight deck. And this ship, the Akagi, was the flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack force. But its second life also didn't end well. So these Japanese aircraft carriers didn't really have a fun time in the later part of the war. Back to the weird stuff on the ships, we have the Hiraga design battle cruiser, which would have been a ship with 10 16-inch guns and a very strange tower and a really weird funnel. There were supposed to be 2 of these ships, but they were never even started. These would have been the next 2 battle cruisers in the 8-8 program, but they weren't finished. This is the Fujimoto design battle cruiser, which would have been the last 2 ships in the 8-8 program. Again, I don't know where these people are getting these pictures from. This would have carried 9 16-inch guns. This caption actually refers to the Hiraga ship. I scanned it from the book. This funnel was a little more reasonable, but it was still kind of weird. The most fearsome, yes?
Is there any theory as to why they would do the weird
they did the
backward
funnels,
facing?
Yeah, they did the weird funnels to angle the smoke away from the bridge. But on the American ships, we just put the funnel further back. This is the number 13 class, which was the most fearsome of the Japanese battleships, which were going to be built. These would have carried 8 18-inch guns, which were really big, and would have been the fastest battleships in the world. So naturally, everybody was really worried about these. One of the reasons why we signed the Washington Treaty. These were, of course, not built. Again, crazy bridge structure, but they got even worse later on. This has a somewhat normal funnel. But these ships, there were going to be 4 of them. They were called number 13, 14, 15, and 16. Great names, but they were never actually started. And this is another action shot from this guy who draws ships in math class. Very, very good drawing right there. So on the eve of World War II, this picture changed a little bit because in the mid-1930s, the battleship holiday, which was their term for not building ships for 10 years, expired. And so all of a sudden, countries began building battleships again, but they were with limits. The treaty limit was that the battleships could not weigh more than 35,000 tons, and they couldn't carry bigger than 16-inch guns. So of course, our Axis buddies started to get creative. So the Germans said it was 35,000 tons, but it was really 43,000 tons. So they just kind of lied. Another thing that they would do is they would use a old system of measurement, which would say it was 35,000 tons, but it really wasn't. And the Japanese were the most devious. They built their battleships under sheds so nobody could see them. The Yamato, which was the world's biggest battleship ever, was actually built underneath a gigantic shed which was covered with leaves to make it look like it wasn't there. And the American observer came in. He said, "Oh, what's in there?" They said, "Nothing." You don't have to look at that, it's okay. And then when it actually came time for World War II, we had no idea that they had the Yamato, and that naturally really freaked us out because the Yamato was bigger than anything else. When it finally came time to sink the Yamato, it was finally sunk by 12 torpedoes and I think 20 bombs, and the smoke plume from the explosion could be seen 100 miles away. So the stage was set for World War II because when the Japanese withdrew from the London treaties, they started to build their own ships again, and everybody used this thing called the escalation clause, where if another country started to build battleships bigger, they could too. So now the race is back on, and everybody's out building each other with bigger ships, and that's where we come to World War II. So here's the World War II never-wers, so to speak. Here's our guys, the Montana, the Alaskas, and the last two Iowas. The British Lion class, again, we had to scrap more than them, but this time we actually chose to do it. It wasn't because of the treaty, and I'll explain why. The Dutch were actually going to have 3 battle cruisers built for them by the Germans. I can see why that didn't pan out. The French were going to build these ships, the Gaston, Clemenceau, and the Alsace class. Again, didn't pan out because the Germans disrupted the party. The Germans were going to do this, and I'll explain the rather humorous story behind this one later on. And Stalin's evil plan was to do all of this. He wanted to build 15 of these ships called the Stalingrad class, but that never happened. In the end, none of these ships ever got built. Japan had to cancel these ones. For this one, we're very grateful that they had to cancel that one. And the Italians were going to build these, but they never got around to it. So the U.S. was going to build 2 more Iowa-class battleships. We did build 4. One of them is just down the road. We were going to build the Kentucky and the Illinois. We got this far in the Illinois and that far in the Kentucky. But we ended up deciding that we needed to put the effort and the materials towards building more aircraft carriers. So we just stopped building battleships, particularly because most of the enemy battleships were either sunk or stuck in harbor, and there wasn't really anything for the battleships to do. What ended up happening was the USS Wisconsin, one of the Iowa-class battleships, had a bad driver and ran into a destroyer. And the bow got severely damaged, so what they ended up doing was they cut the bow off of the Kentucky and welded it onto the Wisconsin. So you could say that this ship actually did go to sea, kind of. The Montana is personally my favorite of the canceled battleships. It would have been the biggest American battleship ever built. It would have been so big that it wouldn't have fit through the Panama Canal. And we were going to build 5 of them. They would have been slower than the Iowas, but a lot more powerful. The Iowa carries 9 16-inch guns. This would have carried 12. And it would have been able to fire these guns 26 miles, fire a shell that weighed almost a ton. And it would have taken 9 powder bags, and a powder bag is this big to fire off 1 shell. It would have been a really crushing weight of firepower. It was built with a lot of the same standardized components as other American ships. It had the same secondary turret, the same main turrets, but they would have been the pinnacle of American sea power. Same reason as the last 2 Iowas. We thought we needed more carriers, so we didn't end up building these. But personally, I'm a little sad. This is what the Montana would have looked like in the Measure 22 camouflage scheme. I have a model of the Montana back there that I made myself, which with the same camouflage. This was a common camouflage scheme used by American battleships. So if you look, it's supposed to look like the water and then a foggy sky. So that's where that comes from. And it was actually somewhat effective. This is an actual shipbuilder's model. You're not supposed to see this, apparently, so don't tell anybody. What? It wasn't actually built. You know that, right? Okay. We would have built 4 more Alaska-class battlecruisers, too. We actually built 2 as it was, the Alaska and the Guam. They were the last battlecruisers ever built, and because battlecruisers had already been proved to be something of a disaster, because the British lost the Invincible, the Indefatigable, and the Queen Mary during the Battle of Jutland and the Hood later on in World War II, were all blown to smithereens because they were battlecruisers. Everybody kind of scratched their heads when we came out with this one. They're like, what the heck? America never built a battlecruiser, and now they're building them? Our reason was because we read the tabloids. There was a rumor that Japan was building pocket battleships like the Germans had, and we said, oh, well, we need to build the Alaskas to go hunt them down. Problem is, the Japanese never were going to build the pocket battleships. So that goes to prove, don't believe everything you hear on the internet. This is the Hawaii, which was the third Alaska-class battlecruiser, and this is how close we got to finishing it, but we just stopped it. The British were going to build the Lion class, and they would have been pretty good ships, but of course not as good as ours by any measure. They were eventually stopped in favor of building another ship, the Vanguard, which used old turrets that were in storage in the hopes that they would finish it by the end of the war, but they didn't. They actually finished it. It was the last battleship ever built, but it was finished a year too late. The French were going to build the Le Clemenceau, which would have carried 8 15-inch guns. It was based on the Richelieu, which was a battleship that was actually built. Has the same problem as the British, where all the guns are up front. The other problem is that there are 4 guns per turret, so if you knock out one turret, there goes half the armament. As the French found out the hard way, when the Vichy French battleship Jean Bart, which had the same design, tried to tangle with the Massachusetts, an American battleship, and came out rather worse for wear. This is the Gascon, which sort of rectified that design. Now we have 1 turret in the front and 1 turret in the back, but they're still quadruples. Again, with the photographs. These pictures actually come from a really great source called Ship Bucket, which is a website where people can draw these old battleships and put them up. And so this is another really great illustration. A lot of my illustrations come from here. This is the Alsace, which would have been the ultimate French battleship. It would have carried 12 15-inch guns and 3 quadruple turrets. And they never even started that because of World War II, which is a little too bad. There's the Dutch one that the Germans were going to build. You know, the Germans didn't build it because they were about to invade the Dutch, so that's why that didn't end up getting done. This is the Italian one, which was, this was based on the Washington Treaty. They had 120,000 extra tons left over, I think, or 90,000 extra tons. So they wanted to build 3 30,000-ton battleships, but they didn't do it. Now we get to our friends, the Germans. And they were going to build these 3 ships, the O, the P, and the Q. That was the code name. Some people think they would have been called the Seydlitz and the Loki and the Derfinger. They would have been named after World War I battle cruisers. They carried 6 15-inch guns, would have been very fast, very deadly ships, so naturally we're very glad that they weren't going to be built. This is the H-class, which they would have built 6 of these. That was their plan under the Z plan. These have an almost legendary status because the Bismarck was such a big deal, and this was a super Bismarck, which had bigger guns and was longer and faster. The thing is, if you do a direct comparison between this and the Iowa would have killed it any day. So it's actually all right. But then we get into a somewhat humorous story about the H-classes, what it would have looked like in action. The H-class design got a little bit bigger every year. When it started out in 1939, the H-39 design was pretty reasonable. It was a normal battleship. It would have carried 8 16-inch guns, pretty normal. Then in 1941, it got a little bit bigger. These are not to scale. If it was, this one would have been like that, and this one would have been like that. Got a little bit bigger. And then in 1943, it got even bigger, and they changed the gun caliber to 20-inch guns. And then in 1944, the H-44 would have weighed 130,000 tons as opposed to the 50,000-ton one, and would have carried 8 to 20-inch guns. The reason for this? The design staff didn't want to get sent to Russia. And Hitler had a big affinity for big things. So they said, well, if we make the battleship a little bit bigger each year, it'll keep him entertained. So they made a bigger battleship every year, and of course it went, yay, big battleship, let's build it. And they didn't get sent to Russia to go fight. And they kept doing this every year, and the battleship kept getting a little bit bigger to the point where this is the H-44 compared to the Enterprise aircraft carrier, which was the world's largest combat ship at one point, compared to the Arizona, the ship from Pearl Harbor, and the California, another ship from Pearl Harbor. This is compared to the Montana, which was the biggest American battleship, and this is compared to the N3, the British one, and another British one, the King George V. Pretty big ship. The problem? If they were going to build the ship, it would have taken a year's worth of Tiger tank steel to build just this one ship. So naturally they didn't build it, but Hitler really liked it. This is the Shinano, which came very close to being, this is the Yamato, which was the largest battleship ever built. The Iowa was longer, but didn't weigh as much, and this had bigger guns. This was the Shinano, which was the follow-on to the Yamato, again with the weird bridge structures. And this would have carried six 20-inch guns. And this is the closest that a 20-inch gunship ever actually came to being built. And it would have looked like that, and it would have looked like that. Wait, I thought it wasn't built. And it was actually finished as an aircraft carrier. Familiar story, right? Its second life didn't end well. If they were really crazy, they would have built the Yokozuna. And the Yokozuna was a increased Yamato, which would have carried 12 18-inch guns, or alternatively 8 20-inch guns. So this is about the equal of the super German one, the H-44. Again, we're very grateful that they didn't end up building it. But they literally didn't have the industrial capacity to turn something out like that towards the end of the war. Meanwhile, in Soviet Russia, Stalin was planning this thing called the Sovietsky Soyuz, which there would have been three of these: the Sovietsky Soyuz, Sovietskaya Ukrainia, and Sovietskaya Belarusia. They were really into Sovietskaya things. These would have carried 9 16-inch guns, but would have been better armored than the American ones. And they were not built. This is a model of what they might have looked like. No one's really sure what the final arrangement was for the design, but this is the best approximation of what they think it looked like. Then they were going to build the Kronstadt, and the Kronstadt was supposed to be a fast battle cruiser. Originally, it was going to be powered by it had German guns. Again, you know, Germans invaded Russia, so that didn't pan out. This is what it would have looked like at speed. The Russians did make some pretty good-looking ships. That's how far they got with it. And then we have Stalin's favorite, the Stalingrad. Maybe because it's named after him, I don't know. But he wanted to build 15 of these. And there would have been, they would have carried an armament of 9 12-inch guns. They would have been very fast, and there would have been a lot of them. But they never got around to it, and that didn't happen. Meanwhile, this ship was also never built. It was designed for Star Trek Phase 2, which was a TV show that was going to go on before they made the movie, and then they ended up making the movie instead, so this one didn't go out. Okay, are there any questions? Yes?
How about China?
China's battleship history is a little complicated. China actually had 2 of the first major turret ships, which was a precursor to the battleship. They were called the Qianyun and the Tingyun, and they were built by the Germans for the Chinese way back in the 1880s, I think. And after that, the Chinese never had a battleship, but there are rumors that the Chinese Navy right now wants to build a battlecruiser based on a Russian ship called the Kirov from the 1980s. Which was a ship that didn't look like it had anything on it, but it had a bunch of missile tubes underneath, which was the main reason why we ended up reactivating the Iowa in the 80s, was to counter that. So the Chinese are supposedly working on a battlecruiser right now, so we'll see how that pans out. They just got their first aircraft carrier operational at the end of 2012, and it's called the Liaoning, so that should be an interesting thing. Are there any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Well, where does the Bismarck fit into all this?
The Bismarck was the immediate precursor to the H-class. So it came right before this one. And the Bismarck, the H-class carried 8 16-inch guns. The Bismarck carried 8 15-inch guns. The Bismarck looked really similar to the H-class. The only main difference is that the Bismarck had 1 funnel instead of 2.
And how, in history of ships built, how would it fare?
The Bismarck is considered to be one of the best battleships that were actually built, but if you look at it on paper, it does have some major design flaws, largely because it was based on a World War I design. The American ship, the Iowa, the Missouri, so forth, are vastly superior ships to the Bismarck. They are better armored, they are faster, and they're better armed. The Iowa class is widely considered to be the best battleship class ever built because it has the best combination of speed, armor, and armament.
Which does?
The Iowa does, yeah. The Yamato had better armor and better armament, but it was not really balanced. Yeah.
In terms of timing, though, did we have the Iowa class when the Germans had Bismarck?
Bismarck was finished in 1941. The Iowa was finished in 1943. The Iowa was begun in 1939, and I believe the Bismarck was begun in 1938. So there's actually a big kind of myth, so to speak, that America started building the fleet that won World War II on December 8th, right after Pearl Harbor, but the reality of the situation is that most of the ships were actually started before Pearl Harbor happened.
Is the movie true, the British defeated it and
The Bismarck?
well, what did they fire out of
Torpedo?
Torpedo?
Yeah,
or
the Bismarck.
something,
The
or-
Bismarck has the most dramatic story of any battleship out there. It led the British on a merry 8-day chase throughout the Atlantic. It actually fought in 2 major battles against the British. The first was the Battle of the Denmark Strait, where it sank the hood. And then eventually the British got really mad, and they basically took every single ship they could find and threw it at the Bismarck. The Bismarck was sunk by the Rodney, which I have a model of over there, and the King George V. The British, of course, like to believe that they sank the Bismarck, but historians generally believe now that the Bismarck's crew actually scuttled it to keep it from being captured by the British. So Bismarck did have a really dramatic story, but the Americans just were better.
You probably saw the movie, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. That's a good one. I actually have some real combat footage. So I think that's it. If anybody has any questions, oh yeah.
So who had the better food on board?
The Italians or the French? That's a good question. I know the American food was considered okay. We have soft serve ice cream on board our ships, which is pretty good. I don't really know anything about the Italian and French food. The French battleships didn't really have much of a chance to do anything during World War II because they were either sunk by the Germans or sunk by the British because the British didn't want the Germans to get the French battleships. The only ones that actually did much of anything were the Richelieu and the Jean Bart, which were similar to the Clemenceau. Yeah, they were pretty much identical to the Clemenceau. And the Richelieu later fought for the Allies, and the Clemenceau went Vichy until it tangled with the Massachusetts, and they actually both survived the war. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate all of you, having taking the time to come here. We have some, I guess, museum pieces over there. We have some canceled battleship models over there, and the flight chart and code table, and we have some Bakita information over there. And feel free to ask myself or Nikos any questions that you might want, or Robert about Bakita, and thank you all for coming.